to roll back various regulations. And add to that mix a citizenry that at this time is very, very polarized, doesn't know whom to trust for good information, and is easily misled about things like, for example, the costs and benefits of government regulation. So when you add those three together, there are many, many different ways in which we could see things for the environment going in the wrong direction. One of the things that we've tried to focus on are the most important threats. We call them scorched earth threats, laws or regulations or policies that not only overturn one rule or one regulation, but actually leave things for future administrations in a position where no progress can be made. So let me give a few examples of what we consider to be scorched earth possibilities. One is a whole slew of anodyne-sounding laws that actually are very destructive. So I'm thinking of things like the REINS Act that would essentially say that federal agencies can't put regulations into effect unless both houses of Congress affirmatively vote for them. It's a formula for paralysis. It's a formula for changing the way we do regulation in this country, which is instead of having scientists and experts make the decisions, you'll have Congress make the decisions. So if bills like that, and there are a number of other examples, get passed, they not only harm one particular regulation or one particular protection that we count on, but really create an environment in which future regulations are impossible. Another example is what we've seen in the last couple of days with Congressional Review Act procedures. We've seen now the invalidation of the stream protection rule, which is designed to protect streams against the harms of mountaintop removal. It looks like we're about to see a rule that requires some reasonable protection against the venting and leaking of methane gas on federal lands, also overturned. And the killer of these is it doesn't just overturn that regulation. It prevents the agencies from acting on anything substantially similar in the future without advance congressional authorization. So again, this is a long-term problem, not just a short-term one. And then the third that seems particularly striking is this executive order that was issued a few days ago, the so-called 2-for-1 rule, that instructs all agencies of the federal government, if they want to do one new regulation, they've got to repeal 2, and there's some kind of overall budget that they have to stay within. So these are big picture things that will just poison the ground for the types of protections that we need. The other thing that we are super concerned about is the state of climate science and the role of the federal government vis-a-vis climate science. You saw what seemed to be a fairly coordinated set of talking points among Scott Pruitt, Rick Perry, and Rex Tillerson on the issue of climate change. And it's sort of what I would call climate denial 3.0. 1.0 was it's a hoax. 2.0 was we're not scientists, so we really can't say. 3.0 is more subtle. It's to acknowledge that something is going on with climate. But the actual role of fossil fuel combustion is not clear. The timing and severity of the impacts are not clear. And so sort of the implicit punchline of all that is it's still not really time to act on this. It's time for more study, perhaps more debate. And what we are really worried about is, and there are some signs that this may be happening, is that the whole apparatus of the federal government, the EPA, NOAA, NASA, all these agencies that do climate science, what would happen if their focus turned to, instead of making the case that climate change is real, what if they were to turn their attention to trying to make the case that there's a lot in doubt, there's a lot we don't know, there's a lot of uncertainty. I'm not saying that will happen, but I think there's some signs that it could happen. And I think as the Society of Environmental Journalists, this is going to be so important for all of you to cover this, to slam and expose the alternative facts about climate science, should they be brought out there, to hear the stories of government scientists and to expose if we get information that that's happening. And that certainly is going to be a major emphasis of our work at the Union of Concerned Scientists. We fought very hard for the last 8 years to get strong science integrity policies at many of the agencies. They're not perfect, but they definitely help, and we're really glad we have those in place, because the free flow of scientific information and the idea of government scientists not being subject to political interference is going to be absolutely critical in this new administration.
Okay,
so I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. Jeff?
Hi, I'm Jeff Rook, and I'm the Executive Director of Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility, which produces the mercifully pronounceable acronym of PEER. We're a service organization for employees. We kind of function as a shelter for battered staff. We work with people across the range of state, local, and federal government, environment, public health, scientists, rangers, attorneys, engineers, and we do an awful lot of direct legal representation where they've asked us to do that, a lot of whistleblower work, but most of our best work is to help them avoid being in a situation where they have to become a whistleblower. And as we go into the Trump administration, we're looking at kind of a cascading series of threats, and thinking about an agency like EPA, the kind of things we're hearing from employees are, first of all, naturally enough, they're sort of a concern for their jobs. Significant budget cuts will likely trigger significant what are called reductions in force or layoffs across the Environmental Protection Agency. And sort of a signal of this was the President Trump's hiring freeze was done not as an economy measure, but as a drain the swamp tool, sort of suggesting that civil servants are a malign force and a coup d'etat has taken place. So you can imagine the amount of kind of anxiety. Like someone running a climate lab will call and say, oh my God, you know, can they take away my pension? Almost like they think they're going to be hunted down by the Gestapo and exterminated along with their family. The second kind of concern is that even if they're able to retain their job, can they do their job? So a lot of what the EPA, as an example, does is it oversees primarily state and sometimes local and tribal programs. 2/3 of the environmental work takes place through federally delegated programs and money that goes out, and making sure that they do the right thing is important, otherwise you have another recurrence like Flint. So if you're in a regional office in EPA and you've got a state agency that's kind of on the verge of doing something that's just sort of unconscionable, the question you have to ask yourself is that if you take action, are you going to be held up as an example of federal overreach and have your career effectively ended? And the third and related dimension is whether or not there's going to be transparency, scientific integrity, whether or not candor remains a firing offense. It's often said that everyone's entitled to their own opinion but not their own set of facts. In fact, in government, largely, you are entitled to your own set of facts. So unless there are rules against it, there's a grand tradition that really was tempered a little bit by the Obama administration, but certainly not countered, that they can tailor facts, suppress, manipulate, so that the only thing that goes out into the public gives you an unobstructed view of the talking points. So we expect to be busy.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks very much. Susan?
Thanks. So I'm Susan Casey Lefkowitz, Chief Program Officer over at the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I want to build a bit on what's been said by focusing on, so what do we do about this? We have these very severe threats that have been outlined. We face real challenges both from the Trump administration and the Congress. And the way that we've been seeing the set of paths forward is one that we have to have all of us working in solidarity, even beyond the environmental movement, to create that stronger movement. Two, that we have to be defending against all of the various onslaughts, whether they're to big cross-cutting issues like anti-regulatory bills that are coming up in the House and the Senate, or whether they're attacks on specific progress that has been made, especially in the last 8 years, like with the Clean Power Plan. And three, that we need to be looking to and supporting the real progress that is still possible, especially at the state and local and international levels. So when we look at building a stronger movement, we've already seen just in the first 2 weeks of the Trump administration, huge advances on that front. You know, the Women's March the day after inauguration was a really powerful day. And I was very proud that NRDC, an environmental organization that has not typically stood in public solidarity across sectors, made the decision that we would be a full partner in the Women's March, standing in solidarity with Muslim groups, with women's groups, with groups from all different sectors. Because what we see is that as attacks come against any one public interest sector right now, they're coming against all of us. And if we don't stand strongly together, we won't be able to defeat those attacks. And so the basic idea here is making the political cost of the kinds of actions that the Trump administration is contemplating and that are being contemplated in Congress too high. If the cost is too high as they're looking at attacks across the public interest sphere, then our idea is that they will start to back down. When we look at the kind of defense that we can bring, litigation is still one of the strongest mechanisms that we have, especially to the kind of actions that are being taken by the Trump administration. And so, for example, NRDC, we brought our first lawsuit just this past week against the withdrawal of the mercury regulation. And this was a critical regulation that had already been finalized to protect health and environment, and withdrawing it was simply an illegal act. And so we've already filed to take EPA to court over that. At the same time, there's a lot that we can look to in terms of where progress is still being made. Earlier today, one of the speakers alluded to the great work that's being done in Ohio. And similarly, I would say, you know, Illinois, Michigan, just since the election, these states under Republican administrations and states that have a big industrial manufacturing base have chosen to move ahead with their clean energy work. In the same time, we see California coming out strongly, New York coming out strongly. What just happened this past week in Maryland. These are all signs that the states are not holding back, that Americans are not holding back, that clean energy and progress on environment is still seen as important. And similarly, when we look internationally, one of the main threats that Trump has made internationally on climate is to withdraw us from the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, our team was in Marrakesh as the election happened, at the first full meeting of the parties to the new Paris Climate Agreement. And what we heard from every country around the world and have continued to hear since then was a commitment to continue to make progress on climate change. And indeed, we see China, for example, out there as a leader. And what we know is the US will become an international pariah if we withdraw from the climate agreement. And the US clean energy industry will lose its foothold as a leader in the world if we withdraw from that agreement. So as we enter an age of alternate facts, the work that all of you do has become more important than ever. Distinguishing fact from fiction, and even more, not allowing the framing to go back to the falsehood of that it's somehow jobs versus the environment. Not allowing the framing to somehow be that it is Trump versus environmentalists, as opposed to Trump versus every person in this country who cares about clean water and clean air. And believe me, that spans political parties, and it spans people from all walks of life. So thank you very much for the work that you do. Thank you for having me here today, and I'm really looking forward to the kinds of comments and discussion we can have now.
Okay, if we can get a couple of mics, or a mic or so, down this way. We have a, well, while we're waiting for that to happen and people to line up for questions, I have a question to you that actually came in before this session, and that is, groups like the ACLU are getting more money, they're getting boatloads of donations now. Are you finding the same thing true in your organizations? Are you becoming financially stronger, bolstered?
Yes, we are, and I think many are. But in addition to the donations, which are up, we're also really excited about the increased membership and the increased participation. Okay. For example, we have
well, we're going to have to move on.
Fine.
Okay. Jeff?
Yes. So the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. How about you, Susan?
The same, and it is mostly the increase in members and activists who are taking action and wanting to find new ways to take action that is so exciting.
Okay, great. We have a question over there. Please identify yourself.
I'm Annalie Grant from S&P Global Market Intelligence. I cover the EPA. Ken kind of touched on this initially, but I'm wondering if you can each give me your thoughts on the 2-for-1 regulation order that Trump put out. What does it mean for employees? What does it mean for the agency's ability to get anything done? And will it even achieve its goal?
And if we could keep those answers brief. Ken, we'll start with you.
It's an absurd idea. I think it's illegal as well. But I think what it really will end up doing, I mean, it's not as if EPA or these other agencies have big buckets of unnecessary regulations that they can just pull out and get rid of in order to do a new regulation. So that just isn't the case. I think at the end of the day, though, it's a formula for paralysis. It's another big hurdle that any agency that wants to take on a new problem is going to have to overcome. And that's, I think, perhaps by design.
Jeff?
A lot of these things that we're seeing are kind of political rhetoric masquerading as policy. So it wasn't like anyone expected the Trump administration to be a font of regulatory energy and activity. They weren't going to be doing much. And so the idea that they were going to have sort of a 2-for-1 sort of put a cap on something that was already dead, as previous speakers have kind of pointed out, where things are going to take place is kind of issue by issue, case by court case, and when they're mandated to do things, they'll have to do them.
Yeah, 2-for-1's another example of how the Trump administration is working hard to undermine critical health and environment safeguards. It's the kind of policy you get when you have a president who believes in regulating by tweeting.
Next question.
Thank you guys for being here today. I'm Aaron Dorman. I'm a freelance writer in upstate New York. I guess my question is about sort of alternative facts, but mentioned how important it was to sort of slam the BS that comes from, that you slam, the BS that comes from climate deniers and stuff like that. But what worries me is that, there are a lot of people, speaking truth to these facts. But I'm wondering, what seems to have happened is there's sort of like two competing sets of facts, whereas like, how do you get people on the other side or move the needles so that people, how do you get your block of facts, which we believe to be true, to be accepted by people who don't, who have their, this sort of who have alternative, like literal alternative facts
So
to describe the world around them.
Kind of doing the politically entrenched ideas on maybe even on either side. Can we start with you, Susan?
Sure. It's a really important issue, and it's one that we're trying to put a lot of thought into, which is how do you reach across what has become a very deep political divide and speak to people in a way that shows that the kinds of things we're talking about when it comes to environmental and health regulation, they go to their everyday lives. They matter for people in terms of their children and their communities. And I think it's something all of us need to find the right way to use real life examples of why these regulations matter, why the kinds of safeguards that are being undermined are actually important for people everywhere all across our country.
Jeff?
I'm a labor lawyer, so I have no idea. But I can give you a short non-answer. And that is, we have a hand in this kind of explosion of rogue Twitter accounts. So when Trump shut down the Park Service Twitter account because it retweeted something about the size of the inauguration crowd, first one and then a number, and now they're at 60. And they have, I think it's 500,000 followers. And what it's taken was this fairly kind of lame, vapid official social media, whose main purpose was to basically just sort of trumpet the talking points, into kind of a movement where public employees on their own time are in direct dialogue with anyone who comes in through the door. And those are the kind of things that we're going to see more of, I think.
Ken?
So obviously it's a challenge, and there's going to always be some people who are not going to be persuaded no matter how well you present the facts. But two things that we have found do work is first of all, focus on local impacts of climate change that people can see in their own daily life and It's no accident, for example, that in Miami we have a Republican congressman who supports acting on climate change because he and people in his district can see the fact that it's flooding in Miami on a sunny day. So that's part of it. A second is the messenger is really important, and we train scientists all across the country to talk to their own communities. And so it's not people from Cambridge, Massachusetts lecturing them on climate change. It's people who share common schools and common various community organizations. And so hearing from trusted messengers is also really helpful. And then the third piece, which is hard, you have to divorce the science from the politics and talk about climate change not as a big government solution that's going to cut back on your freedom, but cut the cord from that and have a discussion about the facts and the science and admit that there are many different solutions that can be done so that people don't see it as such a big threat to their identity, to agree that climate change is happening.
Okay, we have 5 minutes, and I'd like to get both these questions in.
Hi, I'm Anna. I'm a student at Boston University. I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the Keystone and the Dakota Access pipeline and how you think the backlash will, if and how it will affect kind of the future of these projects.
Why don't we start with you, Jeff, then Susan?
Well, I'm going to take a pass on that.
Okay, go pass on that, Susan.
So it's a great question. I've worked for a long time on Keystone XL, really since the fight against it started. And so for me personally, it's been really disheartening to see Trump welcoming Keystone XL to reapply and then having TransCanada immediately put the application in. I don't think it's going to happen, though. It still has to go through a lot of hurdles in Nebraska. And the farmers and ranchers in Nebraska, especially those who live around the Ogallala Aquifer, they know that that pipeline is as dangerous for their water supply today as it was when President Obama rejected it. For the Dakota Access pipeline, I think that it's more difficult, and we see the tribal communities, even today, standing strong and saying that they do not want this pipeline. And Dakota Access has been a real time for almost, I would say, a reawakening of tribal sovereignty issues and advocacy in the United States. And I don't see that going away anytime soon. I think that President Trump is really in for a big fight when he challenges the tribes and their right to decide what happens on their land.
Ken?
Yeah, I think particularly on the Dakota facility, it's going to be decided in the courts. And the fact is, the Army Corps is under order to examine an alternative site. If the Trump administration really wants to revoke that order, I think the courts are going to have a real hard look at whether the agency had really done its duty, which is to examine the possibility of less environmentally damaging alternatives.
Okay, last question here.
I think we've all been I'm Lynn Sherry. I'm a children's book author, illustrator, filmmaker, and journalist. And we've all been, I think, pretty impressed with the way the right wing is so organized with getting the same unified message out, like flip-flops or swift boating. And so I know we've probably all been getting these emails from many different sources about what we can do today, which bill we should write about, who we should send money to. Is there any kind of organized effort for your groups to have these unified messages to get out to the millions of people who came out to the marches so that we could be a stronger force? And then my second question is, League of Conservation voters showed that most people get their environmental information from materials their kids bring home from school, and that they're the greatest force upon their parents to make change. And maybe it might be a way to get around the fake news to get to these kids. And is there are your organizations doing anything to reach out to the youth who are the best messengers because they're going to bear the brunt of climate change?
Yeah. And I will add on top of Lynn's question that SCJ is a large tent. There's some people who do more advocacy sort of reporting, and then there's those of us who don't. So, okay, if you want to answer her question.
Sure. I'll take a crack at the first question, which is, are there groups organizing amongst themselves? And the answer is yes. There's quite a lot of coordination that's going on amongst some of the large environmental organizations, but not just environmental organizations, others as well. And we are developing common messaging, and certainly a lot of the action really focuses on what we all call the Senate firewall. And that's a number of moderate Democrats and persuadable Republicans that all of our groups are focusing a lot of our outreach and advocacy and communications upon to try to win as many of these battles as possible, because as you know, I listed a bunch of the threats. Many of those things will require Senate approval, and we think we have a pretty good shot at staving off a bunch of them. And so I would say that the community is quite focused on that, both in terms of strategy and in terms of messaging.
Yeah. And I would just add that indeed we are working together in that way and on the kinds of priorities that you outlined. And in addition, we're working together across a much broader slate. So the Women's March was a first example of that, and the kind of continuing actions that are coming out of it. But the next big one that's coming up in Washington, of course, is the People's Climate March, which will be on April 29th. And again,
Actually,
that's
the next
be,
one might be considered the March for Science,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
is on April 22nd.
Right.
That's right. And then, that's right, I had just heard that had its date set. So these are going to be important moments of coming together across many communities. And you know, on your point about children, you're right. It's really critical. And I think all of our organizations try to reach out as much as we can to younger people. But it can be challenging. And I think right now it's a special responsibility that we have to make sure that we're working harder to do that even than we have before.
Great. Well, this is the time that we have. We have a 3:15 that's coming in. I'd like to thank our speakers, and I think that they might be around for a little bit if you'd like to buttonhole them for some questions. Thank you.
Thanks.